K-12 public schools are a reflection of America's tremendous diversity. However, teachers and principals are much less diverse than our students. An overwhelming majority of teachers and principals are white and female. While much attention has been paid to diversifying the teacher and principal workforce, a critical education leader has been largely ignored: the superintendent. What do you see, what do you notice about this collage of superintendents? Despite the teaching and principal professions being female-dominated, there seems to be a lot of white males. Raise your hand if your superintendent was a female growing up. Okay. Why does this matter? Diverse leaders provide mirrors for diverse students to see themselves reflected and windows of opportunities to look through others' perspectives. For example, showing young girls that they don't need to internalize social norms in which leadership is seen as a man's world. Additionally, the superintendency is the most highly paid and arguably the most powerful decision-making position in K-12 education. Gender disparities can hinder women's social and economic stability and mobility. It also means that the lens through which issues and policies that local schools are understood, for example, school dress code, is overwhelmingly masculine. As you'll see in a moment, we actually know very little about the superintendent gender gap, but even if we did know, what are we going to do about it? Well, I'd hope we try to close it, but first we need to understand who has access to the door and who doesn't, as well as who's entering, exiting, and moving within the system. Understanding superintendent hiring, attrition, and mobility is important. Superintendent hiring is costly, sometimes between $25,000 and $50,000. It also comes with cultural and educational cost, potentially inciting a general sense of here we go again every time a superintendent turns over. Why is this important now? Here are a few snippets of headlines that have made the news in the past few months. There have been somewhat of a general hysteria over a superintendent exodus, and we have all probably seen the news clips of superintendents being fired without cause from new school boards. There's also been calls to better understand the dearth of women and leaders of color in the superintendency. Yet understanding the superintendency has been nearly impossible. All studies to date have been limited in one or more of these four ways. We have had to rely on flawed sources because there is no national data set of superintendents. While the US Department collects data on large representative samples of teachers and principals, it does not do so for superintendents. Few state education agencies make this data available, and when they do, it's also for a substantial fee or even a petition to the state legislature. Why? Well, some conjecture it's because folks have been uninterested, or worse, that producing this data would invite a critique of a relatively closed system. So since no one else was doing it, I did. In 2019, I collected the name of every superintendent one by one. In the end, I got this cool graph. I learned that there are just as many male superintendents with 12 first names as there are all female superintendents. If you haven't seen it yet, there is a TikTok video of this that went viral 2 weeks ago. If your name's Kevin, don't watch it. The teacher who made the video will call you out. I now have a burgeoning national longitudinal superintendent database with just over 50,000 data points. I ascribe gender to every superintendent in one or more of these three ways, and I'm now able to start to see patterns in some of the data. At this point, if you're in a room full of superintendents and you forget one of their names, you can probably guess Michael, John, or David, and you have a pretty good chance of guessing right. We are seeing a slight closure in the gender gap, which at this rate could lead to gender equality around 2035, but this would likely be because just a few states make a lot of progress. Gender gaps within states vary widely. For example, Vermont does quite well with a nearly 1-to-1 male-to-female ratio. Utah, on the other hand, has 8 men for every woman superintendent. Right here in Tennessee, there are twice as many men as women superintendents. I also have started to look at the types of districts that men and women lead. We now know, for example, that women superintendents serve in districts with significantly more students of color, students on free and reduced price lunch, English learners, and students on individualized education plans. We also no longer have to rely on conjecture about whether or not there is a mass exodus of superintendents. The national turnover rate has increased substantially. 1 out of every 3 districts has experienced one superintendent turnover in the last 3 years, and 5% have experienced more than one. Multiple turnover events are more likely in large districts and in districts that serve larger proportions of students of color. In order to close the superintendent gap, or gender gap, we have to replace the men that turn over with women. It seems like we were poised to do this. Male turnover rates increased by nearly twice the rate of females over the last 3 years. However, over 50% of the time, men are replacing men. We're making pretty slow progress. While men are leaving districts with significantly larger proportions of underserved and marginalized students, women are leaving districts with smaller proportions of these populations. Connecting back a few slides, the big takeaway here is not only do women stay in districts with higher proportions of students that have been intentionally underserved in America's public schools, they're also more likely to be hired there. So what's next? I focused on gender gaps, but racial gaps are also really important. While this is just a fun slide where I used artificial intelligence to generate Pixar superheroes of actual superintendents, I'm beginning to pilot the use of AI as a way to identify superintendent skin tone and putative race. I'm also wading into more details around superintendent mobility and starting to track cohorts of superintendents to better understand how long they stay in one district and in the profession. And for the first time ever, we can track superintendents across state lines, and I'm seeing that women are more likely to move across state lines than men. We value what we measure, and we measure what we value. If working towards equality of access to the superintendency and preventing some teachers and students from undesirable superintendent churn is valued, collecting and analyzing national longitudinal superintendent data must continue to be a priority. Thank you.